We're going to go through our second skeletal system lecture now. I would like you guys to actually access something from your lab manual that will help us go through this lecture and prepare you guys for lab. So if you would please take a look at your lab manual. It's on page 36 and 37 of your lab manual, and it's called the bone list. So our goal in lab is to actually be able to identify all of these bones and the features of the bone on the list. So in this particular lecture, we're going to go through some of the bones and the structures you see on this first page, page 36. In our next lecture, we're going to go through the features on the second page on page 37. All right, so now that you have your list, we're ready to start our lecture. So in this particular lecture, first I want to discuss with you the difference between the axial and appendicular skeleton. Then we'll talk about the skull and the associated bones. Next, the vertebral column. Then the thoracic cage. So first, let's discuss axial versus the appendicular skeleton. So your skeleton overall has 206 bones. The axial skeleton is going to go along the midline of your skeleton. So think about going straight through the midline from the head down the body. The axial skeleton is going to include the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage, which protects your thoracic cavity. So all of these bones are here shown in a darker orange color. Now the appendicular skeleton is everything outside of the axial skeleton. So it's going to include the upper limbs, right here, along with the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle attaches the upper limb to your axial skeleton. It also includes the lower limbs, right here, and the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle attaches your lower limbs to the axial skeleton right here. Let's take a look at the cranial bone. So remember, we're going to need to identify where all these cranial bones are in lab. So go ahead and take a look at your list, and we're going to follow through and look at these cranial bones. The first is the occipital bone. The occipital bone is in the back. Next is the parietal bone. Parietal bone is on the side and the top, shown here in pink. Then we have the frontal bone, which is in the front of your skull, followed by the temporal bone. The temporal bone is right here by your ear. Then we have the sphenoid bone. You see it right here, a sliver in pink. The ethmoid bone, which is right by your nose. And all of these, again, are your cranial bones, and they make up the cranium. Notice this skull is nicely colored. So the coloring, of course, is just for us to visually see where the bones are. Your real skeletons and the ones you look at in lab won't have coloring. Now let's go through the facial bones. So again, you can find these bones on your list. These are the bones of the face, so you'll find them in the front of your skull. You have your maxilla. Maxillae is plural, so you'll have a right and a left maxilla bone. You'll have your palatine bone. The palatine bone you actually can't see in this picture. Notice this is a lateral view, so you're looking at your skull from the side. The palatine bone will have to look at a different view in order to see it. It's actually in the roof of your mouth. Then you have your nasal bone. The nasal bone is near the ethmoid bone. Zygomatic bones, which are your cheekbones. Lacrimal bone, which is your tear bones. They're in green. And the vomer bone. Again, the vomer bone you can't see from this angle. It's also going to be inside your mouth. And then finally, we have your mandible, which is your jawbone. So let's look at the skull from different views, so that way you'll get used to looking at the skull from and identifying bones from different aspects. So we just saw a lateral view. This is the anterior view from the front. So notice we've got the frontal bone, we've got the nasal bone, and then we have your two maxillae, and so on. From the back or posterior view, you basically just see the occipital bone and your parietal bones, left and right. Superior view, so looking from the top looking down, here you have your right and your left parietal bones. This is your nose up here, so this is your frontal bone, and then your occipital bone in the back. Now this is actually an interesting view. It's an inferior view. So imagine you've taken your jawbone off and you're looking up your skull. So this is the rooftop of your mouth. So right here is the maxilla bone. Here you have your palatine bone. So notice it's at the back of the roof of your mouth. So you can actually feel it if you push your tongue against the roof of your mouth. In the front you have the maxilla. And if you bring your tongue all the way to the back, at the very back is the palatine bone on the top. And then right behind that is a little bone called the vomer. So again, both the palatine and the vomer bone are only viewable from an inferior view. All right, so I have a question for you guys. What structure do you think you would find lateral to right here? This is a structure called the external acoustic meatus. So you've got brain, ear, eye, and jaw. Well, hopefully you guys can recognize that this is where the ear would be. So that external acoustic meatus is actually where sound goes into your ear. The reason why I'm pointing this out is you'll notice that under each bone, there's an indentation with a little dash, and there's different things listed. So each one of those little indentations with the dash is a structure you'll find on that bone. So for example, what we just saw was the external acoustic meatus. So the temporal bone is the main bone that it's found on, and the dash indicates that this is a structure on the temporal bone. So notice that on each of these major bones here, you'll find smaller structures that you'll need to identify in lab. All right, one of the next things we want to look at is the sutures that are on your list. So at the bottom left corner on page 36. In order to understand sutures, let's take a look at this review question. The image below is a blank section. Is it a coronal or frontal section, transverse, or sagittal? So this is actually a coronal or frontal section. So notice if you divide it like this, you divide the front from the back. And so that's a coronal section. The reason why I mentioned this is because the sutures are going to be named after these type of sections. So what sutures are boundaries between the skull bones. So remember, your skull is made up of a bunch of different bones, and basically the sutures are the boundaries between the bones. It'll help you identify one bone from the next. So there's four main sutures that we need to find. The first is the coronal suture. So remember, that divides the front and the back. So right here, you see the coronal suture. This is a superior view. So this is the frontal bone in the back, in the front. And then behind it is the right and left parietal bone. So the suture here, coronal suture, is the boundary between the frontal bone and your two parietal bones. Next, you have your squamous suture. The squamous suture is actually on the side of your skull, and it goes around the temporal bone. So this right here is your squamous suture. So it'll be the boundary between your temporal bone and your parietal bone, frontal bone, and occipital bone. Then you have your sagittal suture. Remember, a sagittal section divides left from right. So again, take a look at the superior view of the skull, and this boundary right here is your sagittal suture. So it's going to divide your right from your left parietal bone. And the last suture that we need to identify is the lambdoid suture. The lambdoid suture is on the back of your skull, the posterior side, and it's going to divide the occipital bone below with the parietal bone on the top. And it'll almost look like a triangle going on both the right and left sides. So let's continue on with your skull and look specifically at the sphenoid bone and ethmoid bone. So what we have here is an interior view of the skull. So we basically taken off the top part of the skull and we're looking down. So this is the front and this is the back. So highlighted in pink is the sphenoid bone. So if you were to remove the sphenoid bone from the skull, it would have this shape, almost like a butterfly. Now, notice on your list, there are some features that you need to find in the sphenoid bone. The first is the optic canal. So a canal is a small hole or opening. So right here, you'll notice there's a canal. And the reason why this one's called the optic is that this opening goes to the eye socket. So if you were to actually poke something through the optic canal, it should come straight out your eye. Another term that you need to know on the sphenoid bone is the foramen ovale. So the foramen ovale is this long hole, oval shape. Foramen means hole, and then ovale is the shape. So you have one on the left side and one on the right. And the last thing you need to know about the sphenoid bone and identify is something called the sella turcica. The sella turcica is basically this indentation, or almost looks like a saddle seat inside the sphenoid bone. And that's actually what sella turcica means. It actually means a saddle. So that, again, is right in the middle here, is an indentation in the sphenoid bone. Now for the ethmoid bone over here, again, it's right inside that nasal cavity. You pull it out, it looks like this. So on the ethmoid bone, you're going to need to identify three things. So the crista galli is the sharp ridge pointing up on the ethmoid bone. The cribriform plate is the flat surface that the crista galli projects out from. So again, it's this flat surface right here. On the cribriform plate, when you go into lab and look at the cribriform plate, you'll notice that it's not completely smooth. There's actually these really tiny holes there, and those are olfactory foramina. Remember, foramen is a hole, foramina are tiny holes. Olfactory is for smell. So it turns out that the olfactory foramina are actually going to be tiny holes for nerve endings for your sense of smell. All right. Moving on to the sinuses. So you'll notice on your list that there are the paranasal sinuses. The sinuses are hollow spaces that help warm, moisture, and filter your air. So you might notice your sinuses because if you're sick, you might say, I have sinus pressure. You would feel it a lot more. So think about where you would have that sinus pressure. Right here in your forehead, this is what we call the frontal sinus. Then you might feel it on your cheeks. This is called the maxillary sinus. It's right by the maxillary bone. These here are the ethmoid and the sphenoid sinuses. So again, right by the ethmoid and sphenoid bone. So here's a side view or a lateral view. So we covered the 4 paranasal sinuses. The paranasal bones are the bones that you can find the sinus in. So for instance, the frontal bone, you find the frontal sinus. The ethmoid bone, you find the ethmoid sinus, and so on. So now we've actually covered the bones of the skull. So let's go ahead and look at the associated bone. The hyoid is actually a really unique bone. It's a bone that does not articulate with any other bone in the body, meaning that it's all by itself. I like to recognize the hyoid bone because it looks like almost like little vampire teeth right here sticking up. And here it is actually in the proper size and location in your body. It's basically at your neck. So the hyoid bone is going to be good for actually attaching a lot of muscles. For instance, the muscles of your tongue and some muscles of your throat will anchor into the hyoid bone. So that wraps up the skull and the associated bones as part of the axial skeleton.